Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the OSSTF FEESO Parent and Community Partner Series webinar, The Importance of Face-to-Face Learning for Ontario Students. I'm happy to have all of you here tonight. My name is Tracy Marshall, and I am staff in the Communications and Political Action Department at OSSTF. I'd like to read a personal land acknowledgement. The land that surrounds us is part of who we are. It reflects our histories. I am a settler and uninvited guest on this land. Reconciliation is a deeply personal journey, and I encourage you to learn more about the 94 calls to justice in the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The indignity, injustices, and discrimination that Indigenous people continue to endure weakens the fabric of our entire society. Colonization, assimilationist policies, and the scars inflicted by residential schools have damaged cultures and kinships and have resulted in distressing gaps in health outcomes and living conditions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. OSSTF FEESO is an educational organization which represents teacher and education worker members. Our central office is in the community of Scarborough and Toronto, but we have 35 district offices across Ontario. Please feel free to acknowledge the traditional land that you're participating from today in the chat and give thought to the generations of people who were stewards of that land. In the 1950s, when Scarborough was being developed, a Wendat burial site was uncovered on the spot where Tabor Hill Park sits, and that's close to our provincial office in Scarborough. The Wendat people, who the Europeans called the Huron, practiced a special burial ceremony, and they dug out individual graves, cleaned each of the bones carefully, and had a celebration where they dug and filled a trench with the mixed bones. The mound that was created was, when the earth was laid on top to cover the bones, were created all across Toronto. And these mounds can be found in many different areas. So when you encounter one, it's important to remember that you are in the presence of a sacred space. Today, I'm speaking to you from Guelph, which is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and mixed ancestry people. Today, I recognize the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and people, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect on the traditional territory I'm speaking to you from today. It is my wish that we can carry that spirit of peace, friendship, and respect into this special gathering today. I thank generations of people who were stewards of this land for thousands of years before my family settled here. And as I said, please feel free to acknowledge where you're coming from today and where you're participating from in the chat if you wish. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for the evening, our president, Karen Littlewood. And Karen is a special education teacher from Barrie, and of course is the president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. Karen was born in Barrie and received her Bachelor of Science in Languages at Laurentian University and completed her Bachelor of Education with Nipissing University. She started her career as an elementary teacher in York Region before moving back to Simcoe County in 2000. In 2007, Karen became a secondary teacher for the Simcoe County District School Board, where she taught life skills and special education. Karen became the president of both the district in the Barrie area and the teacher bargaining unit and of the district and the teacher bargaining unit for District 17 Simcoe, and held a number of other roles both locally and provincially, including vice chair of our provincial council and chair of the Communications and Political Action Committee. In addition, Karen was a very active member of the Barrie and District Labour Council. She was elected to the provincial executive as an executive officer in 2017, then as vice president in 2019. Karen is an advocate of clear and open communications with OSSTF FEESO, as well as within the public when it comes to education issues. She is committed to working with the provincial executive to enact the action plan to support equity and anti-oppression that we're putting in place as we speak, as well as addressing systemic barriers within the Federation. She is a strong promoter of equity issues within OSSTF FEESO and beyond, and believes in the importance of building coalitions to affect positive change at all levels of education in the labor community movement and in our communities. It's as only the 11th female president of OSSTF FEESO in its over 100-year history, Karen recognizes the important role she's taking on and seeks to be a strong role model for women and for others in the organization who do not see themselves reflected in our leadership. Thank you so much, Karen, for being with us tonight. And I'm going to pass it over to you to give the introductions and be our wonderful moderator. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy, for the introduction. I want to start by thanking the panelists for being here. We have quite a distinguished panel of people who are going to be informing us. And as a teacher since 1991, I know that face-to-face is the best way for students to learn, but sometimes you need other people to help reinforce that for you. So I really look forward to hearing from our panel. I'm going to speak for a few minutes now in the introductions, and then I won't be speaking a whole lot more, but I look forward to moderating the panel. I'm going to start with Beyhan Farhadi. Beyhan is a postdoctoral visitor in the Faculty of Education at York University and a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ontario. She is also a secondary teacher at the Toronto District School Board and an advocate for a fully funded anti-oppressive public education system. At York University, Beyhan works with Dr. Sue Winton on policy enactment and research the implementation of educational policy online during COVID-19 school closures. Beyhan is not only a steering committee member of the President's Advisory Council on EDI, she is also a member of the Institute for Research on Digital Literacies at York University, working as the Digital Learning, Technology, and New Pedagogies Cluster Lead. Beyhan holds a PhD in Geography from the University of Toronto in 2019 and an MA in English from York University in 2010. Her dissertation research examined the relationship between e-learning and educational inequality in the Toronto District School Board. She is currently revising this dissertation for a book project with the University of Toronto Press in 2022. Beyhan's work studies schooling as a spatial arrangement and ordering system in which intersecting axes of privilege, domination, and oppression disciplines agency and shapes educational policy. Specifically, she is interested in how online learning reflects and impacts this arrangement and order, which is traditionally studied face-to-face, as well as the role of social movements and labor organizing in affecting change. Concurrent projects include supporting Dr. Naila Kalita May as assistant editor of the Rutledge Performance Archive on the subject of Black theater and performance. Beyhan is also on the steering committee and research team for Toronto the Better, Renewing Local Democracy at the City Institute at York University, as well as incoming chair for Critical Geographies of Education, American Association of Geographers Specialty Group. Jason Bradshaw is a secondary teacher in his 15th year with the Peel District School Board and is currently teaching at Castlebrook Secondary School in Brampton. Jason is a recent recipient of the Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence. Congratulations, Jason, on this exceptional achievement. Over the last 2 years, like many educators, Jason has had extensive experience teaching fully online and in a hybrid model, which contrasts with his many years of teaching face-to-face. Jason's focus is to promote equity, representation, and critical thinking in his classroom. David Lepofsky is a visiting professor of disability rights and legal education part-time at the Osgoode Hall Law School and a past adjunct member of the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. He holds volunteer leadership roles in the disability community. He is chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. He is member and past chair of the Toronto District School Board's Special Education Advisory Committee. He is also a member of the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Education Standards Development Committee, appointed by the Ontario government to recommend reforms to tear down barriers impeding students with disabilities. In 1979, David Lepofsky graduated with honors from Osgoode Hall Law School with a Bachelor of Laws. He obtained a Master of Law from the Harvard Law School in 1982. He was admitted to the Ontario Bar in 1981. From 1982 to the end of 2015, he practiced law in Toronto with the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General in the areas of constitutional, civil, administrative, and most recently, criminal law. In 2004, he was appointed to the position of General Counsel. This is the highest promotion in the Ontario Public Service outside management. It is reserved for the most senior counsel to recognize career achievement in handling the most complex work, demonstrated diversity of expertise, creativity, professional leadership, judgment, and mentoring or role modeling. He has appeared on at least 30 cases in the Supreme Court of Canada in his career as counsel or co-counsel, and in some 200 cases in the Ontario Court of Appeal. He retired from his position with the Ontario Public Service at the end of 2015. For 30 years, he has served as a part-time member of the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, where he taught an advanced constitutional law seminar each year on freedom of expression and press. He plans to resume this again in the fall of 2021. That's now. From 1987 to 2005, he served as associate head of the Ontario Bar Admissions Courses Public Law section. Since the late 1970s, he has been active in a volunteer capacity, advocating for new laws to protect the rights of persons with disabilities in Canada. In 1980, he appeared before the Joint Committee of the Senate and in the House of Commons on the Constitution of Canada on behalf of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind for an amendment to the proposed Charter of Rights to guarantee equality rights to persons with disabilities. The efforts of a great many combined to lead Parliament to pass the Disability Amendment to the Charter. From 1980 to 1982, he served on the leadership team of a broad disability coalition that successfully advocated for inclusion of protection against discrimination based on disability in the Ontario Human Rights Code. David led the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee. That coalition successfully campaigned for 10 years to win passage of 2 new Ontario laws to make Ontario fully accessible to persons with disabilities: the Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2001 and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005. Since then, he has helped in efforts to get that law effectively implemented. In late February 2009, he became chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. He and the Alliance have pressed for the prompt enactment and enforcement of strong accessibility standards under the Disabilities Act. In 2010, they succeeded in getting Ontario election legislation amended to address accessibility barriers impeding voters with disabilities, although they have more to do to get telephone and internet voting to become a reality in Ontario elections. In addition to advocating at the provincial level, he has led the AODA's Alliance's advocacy efforts to secure the enactment of a strong accessibility legislation at the federal level, appearing before standing committees of the House of Commons in October 2018 and the Senate in April 2019. His advocacy efforts combined with those of many others to lead the enactment of the Accessible Canada Act in 2019. David's awards include investiture in the Order of Canada in 1995, the Order of Ontario in 2007, and the Terry Fox Hall of Fame 2003, honorary doctorates from Queen's University, the University of Western Ontario, and the Law Society of Upper Canada, and awards from other organizations, including the City of Toronto, the Law Society of Upper Canada, the Ontario Bar Association Public Lawyers Section, the Advocate Society, the Ontario Crown Attorneys Association, the Ontario March of Dimes and Community Living Ontario. In March 2020, the American College of Trial Lawyers awarded him the Samuel E. Gates Award for contributing to improvements in the litigation process. He was very flattered and humbled when the Canadian Lawyer magazine August 2010 edition listed him among Canada's 25 most influential lawyers. However, he was left wondering, and I quote, "If I am so influential, why doesn't anyone listen to me?" And finally, we have Riya Bhatla. Riya is a former York Region District School Board student who is in her third year of interdisciplinary social science and concurrent education at York University. She is co-chair of York Communities for Public Education, a coalition of parents, childcare parents, education workers, students, and community allies working to maintain high quality public education in York Region. With a passion for helping others, Riya is also working as a peer mentor coordinator at Vanier College and co-director of chapter programming at the international not-for-profit charity Crafting for a Cure. In her spare time, Riya enjoys creative writing, going for nature walks with her dog Kobe. She is committed to working towards an equitable and inclusive world for her future students. Amazing panel. I'll just repeat that. So we'll get started. More from the panelists, less from me, please. It's been an incredible and almost inconceivable 2 years in education. Students, teachers, education workers, and parents have had to pivot. I know that word bothers a lot of people because it's been said a lot over the last couple of years. They've had to pivot continuously from in-class, face-to-face learning to online to hybrid, and then back to face-to-face for some students. There's even some speculation as recently as today as if it's going to happen again in the near future. And now with COVID-19 infection rates again climbing, we are again wondering if Ontario classrooms will head to fully online in the near future. There are many types of online learning, and we're going to talk about a few of them this evening. From your perspective, what do you see as the differences between online learning, hybrid learning, and virtual learning? And I'll point out those are 3 of the terms that are used, and there's probably more, but what are the differences between those different types of learning? So I think I might go to Beyhan first, if you're amenable to that, Beyhan.
Sure. I'll try to unravel the really complex terminology. And I think it's complex in part because so much of this is emerging during the pandemic and a lot of the definitions are contested. And so I think it is important to define the terms when discussing its impact on students. And also, we're talking about a wide range of students when we are going K to 12 and including adult learners in the system. And I distinguish between pre-pandemic and emergency pandemic online education. And when I use the term online learning, I try to be specific about whether I'm referring to asynchronous models where you're not learning at the same time in the same place, and where the teacher's in the background, versus synchronous models where the teacher is in the foreground, but requires much more resources from on part of the student and their families. And so asynchronous models are often standardized courses in Ontario. They're licensed by the Ministry of Education, and their license is renegotiated every number of years. That's what we associate most frequently with pre-pandemic education. It's often been the case that these courses have attempted to fill the gaps where there wasn't in-person learning available. So online learning has been here for some time, but it hasn't been very widely accessed. It's been an accommodation in some senses. Synchronous models where the teacher is live has been emerging during the pandemic as with the intention, I think, on the part of the ministry to approximate or replace face-to-face learning. And I think many of us here understand that it is that they're not the same thing. And so in trying to sort of replicate face-to-face instruction, we have created a lot of inequitable conditions. Younger students, and again, it really depends on the age that you're speaking of. So younger students, those with uniquely intensive needs often require more synchronous support, but the support is more expensive to deliver. And again, requires access to resources to engage in live instruction. Even adults struggle to learn in online and independently. And oftentimes we think about online learning as simply limited to the delivery of content. quality online education for any proponents of it, talk about it being really expensive, resource intensive, more so than in person. And in compulsory public education, I've always argued it cannot replace in-person learning, mass delivered in-person learning. And so I do advocate for its use and as an exception or an accommodation, but not as a rule. And I really think that it's important to center teacher professional judgment, teacher-driven integration of technology into face-to-face environments, not for the replacement of teachers with technology, which is where I sort of see some of this discourse going. The term virtual school or virtual learning academies in Ontario refers to full-time synchronous online education, and online and hybrid learning is perhaps enrages me the most and is the most unique because before the pandemic, it used to refer to a model where students would learn part-time in person, part-time online, but not at the same time. But during the pandemic, it refers to simultaneous model of instruction where teachers respond to student learning online and in person at the same time. And I've yet to see any respected or accredited online learning professional support this model. And many have spoken publicly about its harms. And so school boards have been clear about why they're using hybrid as well. The Ministry of Education requires them to offer full-time synchronous online education without the funds to support virtual schools. And this is important in the context of a pandemic. It's not a category of online education that in Canada is limited to Ontario, but it is important to note that not all school boards are using hybrid, and many are prioritizing models of online education that better serves students and teachers. And better models understand as a basic fact that when you are teaching in an online classroom, it is a separate space than an in-person classroom, and each require different strategies to engage students meaningfully. But when you force teachers to teach in two places at once, this is my geography coming through here, students lose instructional time. And teachers are unable to logistically differentiate their methods to meet the individual needs of learners. So that's, I'll leave it at that.
I struggle just to find the mute button, so it's challenging. Thanks so much, Beyhan, and I really appreciate that you made that distinction about emergency, because we really have to keep that clear that this is emergency measures that we're using right now for much of this, and we have to consider that going forward, that just because you use it in an emergency, it might not be the best idea going forward. I'm going to turn to Riya for her perspective as a future teacher, but a current student. What do you see as the difference between these different methods, and maybe your perspective as a student undergoing or trying to learn through these methods?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I think, Beyhan's definitions were extremely comprehensive and covered my understanding of those terms as well. But I know that terminology switches over time and changes as students navigate, especially, a crisis learning model. But one thing that I would like to emphasize is I think there's a difference in terms of choice. We see, especially with the hybrid model, there's a choice to learn in person or a choice to learn online. But there isn't actually freedom of choice because every student has different circumstances, and that's where the inequitable part comes in, because not everyone has the freedom to choose. There are medical circumstances, family situations that limit a student's opportunity to choose or opt for in-person learning as opposed to online learning. And as a former YRDSB student, I went through kindergarten to grade 12 completely in person, no challenges like this, no mandated online courses to take in high school. And then switching into university, seeing this, again, the asynchronous versus the synchronous. And the main impact that I've seen, amongst fellow students and even just talking to students who are in high school right now, is the impact in terms of interacting with the curriculum and interacting with educators. That same quality of education is not there. A lot of questions are left unanswered. And mainly, the way I see the difference is Online learning to me is something that is a choice, something that you do because maybe you have an interest in taking on a more independent learning format. But when you switch to virtual or hybrid, that's a response to an emergency. It's not something that's meant to be permanent. It's meant to be a temporary solution. But unfortunately, the way that it's going, it seems like this temporary solution is being changed into something that certain people want to become permanent. But I'm sure we're going to discuss, some of those difficulties in those challenges in doing so going forward throughout the webinar. But the main difference that I see is the temporary solution versus something that there is choice in. Where is their freedom of choice? And I think that's something that, results in harsh inequities across the board.
Thanks, Riya. Appreciate that. I'm going to go to Jason next for the perspective as a teacher. And Jason, if I could also ask you to maybe highlight within the Peel District School Board specifically what hybrid looks like. There's been, the viewers of the webinar may be familiar with, may not be familiar with, and maybe you could describe a little bit about what that's like. And then I'll go to David finally after Jason for comments on the differences between these different methods.
First of all, thank you for asking this question. I think understanding the distinction in the language is very important because there is a lot of confusing terminology. And it is worth noting, as Beyhan and Riya both mentioned, that at some point since March of 2000, when we first faced our school shutting down, we've kind of stopped referring to it as an emergency measure in terms of the remote or distant learning that we're doing. And to me, that really is concerning because I'm worried about this being normalized. And it is absolutely something that is not working well in most circumstances, and it can't be made to become the norm. Online learning, as I understand it, is a concept that focuses mainly on asynchronous learning, which has been used for some time, even before the pandemic, but mostly for adult learners, or at least for teenagers, high school students who choose to be in that model. And just as Riya mentioned, it's a matter of choice. It's not something that should be mandatory or required, which is something that I think we'll address in another question as well, because we know the government still wants to make it a mandatory part of education, and it's just not something that works for every learner. Virtual learning is based more on a synchronous learning approach, and that's trying to emulate or to simulate what we see in a face-to-face classroom. And again, it's not something that's going to work for every learner. It's not something that you can easily mimic through a computer screen. We have very dynamic classes that we teach. We have dynamic learners. We have dynamic curriculum. It can't always be simulated through a webcam, no matter how much we try, no matter how much technology we infuse into the classroom. And then, of course, we have the hybrid learning, which I have quite a lot to say about, because as you mentioned, it is something that the Peel board has been doing since the previous school year. And for those who aren't familiar, hybrid basically means that I have students in my classroom, I'm teaching them face-to-face, and at the same time, I have learners at home who I'm teaching virtually, synchronously. So it is literally doing two jobs at the same time. It is being in front of students, delivering the material, delivering the content, delivering the lessons. And at the same time, you have students at home who are literally looking from the outside in. And anytime there's any kind of a technological failure, the Wi-Fi goes down, a computer crashes, they're effectively kicked out of class. And there's so much inequity just in that aspect of it alone. Again, that's something I think we'll touch on some later questions. But it's not something that one person can do effectively because they're fundamentally two different jobs. And there definitely is a place, I think, for online and virtual learning. As Beyhan mentioned, it's a fantastic way to accommodate special needs, special circumstances. And that's something that has existed since before the pandemic. There have been online options. We have the technology, we have the resources. We have teachers who specialize in that area, but not every teacher is necessarily comfortable or willing to teach in that manner, and that's fine. Like, we all have our specialties, we have our training. Most of us were not trained to teach remotely. We weren't trained to teach synchronously in a virtual setting, and that's fine. And we've had to adapt because of the pandemic, obviously. But again, it can't be normalized. Most of us are just trying to survive and to do the best that we can for our students. But there's just so much of a difference in the instructional approaches, the pedagogy, and we're all learning on the fly. We have been for the last almost 2 years now, and it's not giving the students the best experience and the learning experience that they deserve. So again, I need to emphasize, we're talking about emergency measures that should not be normalized. Hybrid teaching is presented as an attempt to include students at home in the classroom. They're not included in the same way. They know that. They feel that they're not included in the same way. We're pretending that it's a method to kill two birds with one stone, but really we're missing both the birds because we're trying to do two things at the same time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason. The birds might be happy that you're missing them, but I think we need to be doing a little bit more in education too. And the fact that it's two different jobs, it's one person trying to do two different jobs, and the students probably don't feel like either in the classroom or at home that they're a priority, because the teachers really got to be dividing their time. So David, I'll go to you now for this question, the difference between online, hybrid, and virtual. You've got probably a different perspective as someone not as closely linked to the classroom right now as Jason or Beyhan or Riya. So
well, I'm actually, I've got two angles on it. One, well, three. One is a disability rights advocate, lots that I got to draw on that. The second, as a parent, the student in the system, and the third is I teach at a law school, and I'm dealing with all of this at the other end of delivering content. Let me offer two thoughts. The first is the terminology I want to focus on is the term hybrid learning, because there are two uses of that term, and everybody here is using it in one way, and that's the way I get. But it's important to understand that listeners may hear two different things, especially outside the OSSTF envelope. One version of hybrid learning, which is what you're talking about, is Jason, the teacher, has pupils in the classroom and has some watching at the same time at home. And he's supposed to teach them both at the same time, same content. That's what I'm going to talk about. But the other use of the term, and this is what confounds people, is if a school for your child is going to be open Monday and Tuesday for in-person attendance of the class, but closed Wednesday and Thursday because they want to keep the numbers in the building down, another class will attend in person instead. And the students who are at home will have classes on Monday and Tuesday entirely in person, and then Wednesday and Thursday entirely virtually. And that means that's different. None of us are talking about that tonight, but it's important for you to understand that there is the word hybrid has been understood first by some in terms of that, and I've had to clarify that for some people. So let me now hold up a disability lens to hybrid learning in the context that we're talking about. Jason, who's got to be serving two audiences at once. Oh, by the way, before I go further, Karen, you mentioned this. I'm going to teach you a blindness trick. If you're using Zoom and you don't have time to get to your unmute button and you're muted, just put your finger on the space bar and hold it down. And while you're pressing down on the space bar, you're unmuted. That's a keyboard equivalent for blind people like me, but it's available to all of you. Anyway, so if I give you nothing else useful, that'll be useful. So here's the thing. Here's the disability lens on this. Our school system is more or less designed and operated from top to bottom on the assumption that it's serving one kind of student only, and that's students without disabilities. Students without disabilities are treated as it's a one-size-fits-all starting point. And then students with disabilities, we deal with through afterthought measures, whether we call it special education or accommodation or whatever. And then we build a structure around you teachers that handcuffs your ability to do that effectively. That's why we end up with a school system that is so full of barriers facing students with disabilities. And I view this hybrid learning thing in that context. So here's examples. Number one, when the moment we talk about a teacher having to teach like Jason just described, what we've basically done is hung a sign out saying blind people will not teach here, because there is no way a blind person like me could effectively teach. I mean, even if we assume that sighted people can serve both audiences at the same time, and I don't think you can, there's no way if I'm in front of a class speaking to students and trying to keep my ears focused on them, I can't look at that screen to see if somebody's raised their hand and so on. And it's basically an employment barrier, a big time human rights code violating employment barrier. So that's the first part of the disability lens. Now let's look at it through the perspective of the student. Students with disabilities who need an environment where they can learn typically are, if they need any variation in teaching technique, need to be able to engage directly with the teacher. As it is, it's challenging enough for a teacher who's teaching a bunch of students in their classroom to be sure that they're diversified, that they're using universal design in learning, and that they are effectively accommodating the learning needs of all learners. When we then stick some of them at home, if they have a disability, like, good luck, you've now made it even harder to serve their needs in this model of teaching. And for the student with a disability in the classroom, if they need some additional focus, attention, or whatever, the teacher is now even more handcuffed in terms of meeting their needs, because the teacher has to divide their attention, not just among the classroom students, but try to figure out what the heck is going on at home. And I mean, it's a formula for failure. And which is why I would argue whether or not one opposes hybrid learning for all students, and I think there's a credible case for disapproving it, there should be clearly a ban on it if there are students with disabilities in either the at-home population or the in-class population. From a human rights code perspective or a disability lens. Now, for some students with some disabilities, virtual learning may be more effective. And that's one of the things that we've learned. For some kids, it may in some circumstances be more effective. And what we've also learned in the university setting is being able to attend a lecture virtually, even if it's taught in person, may be an important accommodation to students with chronic pain situations, chronic immunity, fatiguing conditions, and so on. But that's a very different world from K-12 learners. Let me conclude by saying, because I know we're going to have more to talk about, but as you talk about these various things, online learning and so on, there's another piece of the disability lens I want to apply to it. When the government announced a year and a half ago at the start of this whole nightmare that they were going to come up with a new strategy because of the emergency, you had to cut them some slack, because, like, who saw this coming? And this is like unheard of thing to deal with, and it's public health, safety, and all that stuff. But their move was to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach to students with students. So they're either all going to learn at home and then have virtual learning, or the design for coming back all was designed on the hypothesis that students only have no disabilities. And those of us who advocate saying, no, you've got to also build into it not a one-size-fits-all approach, but an approach for students with disabilities. Their answer was, oh, well, we're telling school boards to also accommodate students with special ed needs. In other words, here's your one-size-fits-all solution. Now you guys figure out how to fix the rest of it. And all 72 boards, why don't you all reinvent the same wheel? This is not clever. But it came to its peak as an illustration when our Minister of Education repeatedly said that the government's partnering with TV Ontario to deliver online learning. Well, my coalition got a volunteer with expertise in online accessibility to look at TVO's online teaching resources. And it took, I think, under 5 minutes to start identifying serious accessibility barriers. And last time we checked, they haven't been fixed. We've raised this with the minister. I raised this at length with the vice president of TVO for digital content. And the government solution was not to fix it, but to give TVO more responsibility for online learning. So through a disability lens, when I hear online learning, I hear welcome to more barriers facing students and teachers and parents with disabilities. Back to you.
Thanks, David. And I'm using the spacebar this time because it's easier to reach. Thank you. TVO kind of triggers me because my school board, the Simcoe County District School Board, has a real, they really like TVO and they really think that's going to be the answer to all their problems and it's going to be a cheap solution, and it absolutely has not been. And I see Beyhan nodding because she did a delegation to our board, which it was not appreciated or I think maybe even understood, but I'm trying to not be political here.
By the way, credit to TVO, the only media that's covered this, and we've raised this, was Steve Bacon.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah, it's a little ironic, isn't it? The next question we're going to go to, and I will be starting with Jason, is, and David, you very astutely pointed out that there are some students for whom online or virtual learning is more appropriate depending on circumstances, that there is no one size fits all, but really for the majority of students and education workers, face-to-face or in-person learning in a classroom setting with a teacher and other education workers present is the preferable method of learning. So Jason, from your expertise, what do you see are the benefits of face-to-face learning?
Well, I'm a science teacher, so obviously there's a lot of hands-on experiences that are just crucial to learning science. And now that the pandemic has been going on for almost like 2 years now in terms of when we've begun going online, obviously students who I'm teaching now in grade 12 or grade 11, they did not get to have many opportunities to actually perform any of the hands-on experiences that are part of science. And when I look at my students who are now in grade 12 or grade 11, who are preparing to go on to post-secondary destinations, whether it be university, college, or workplace, many of them are wanting to go into STEM-related fields. And it's very difficult for me to say that they've been properly prepared when some of them haven't had an opportunity to hold a beaker or a test tube even. And there's only so much that can be done in a virtual setting to simulate what needs to be the skills that need to be learned for a science lab. If you've never actually performed an experiment, then when you go to university and college or workplaces and there's that expectation for you to have that skill, there's only so much that you can learn through a simulation. Now that I have hybrid classes, I can even sometimes live stream the labs that they're doing. Just today, I had a chemistry class. They learned how to make soap, which the students who were in class really enjoyed the experience. They got to learn so much. They got to literally have hands-on science. They got to wash their hands with the soap that they actually made. Meanwhile, I was just carrying around an iPad and just live streaming it to the students at home, saying, "Oh, look at this! You can record what you see, and you know you can look while we do." And again, it's an instance of being on the outside looking in. The hybrid method is really notorious for this situation. At least if it's a fully online or fully virtual setting, you can try to tailor the curriculum to that. And even though simulations and videos can't replace what you do in the classroom hands-on, at least you can focus your attention on that. Whereas in a hybrid setting, you still want to do the hands-on. You want the students who are in person to get the most of that experience, and in a way that's almost more of an insult almost to the students who are at home and have to just watch. But even going beyond teaching science as a specific example, teaching itself is a fundamentally interpersonal interaction with people. I don't think that our brains are really hardwired to interact through a screen or through a microphone in the same way as having a person there with you, like literally standing beside you. Every moment when I'm working with students, I'm observing them. I'm watching their learning, their thought processes, even their emotional well-being. There's so much that we can pick up on just by being in the room with students, and seeing and interacting and listening to them, as opposed to doing it through technology, which creates a large barrier. Even assuming that students are turning on their webcams, they're turning on their microphones, which of course raises a whole lot of privacy issues as well. I personally don't feel comfortable requiring my students to have their cameras on, because at that point they're showing us into their homes and they don't necessarily feel comfortable doing that. And I don't feel comfortable asking them to. So most of the time, my students are interacting with their webcams off. So I'm losing that ability to interact with them in that way. Oftentimes, they may not even be comfortable turning their microphones on. So they're interacting with me through a chat. So once again, I'm losing a level of connection with them. Again, going back to what I was saying, teaching is an interpersonal interaction. It needs to have those levels of connections. And I believe that students themselves feel better supported when there's a person in the room with them who can look over their shoulder, who can look at the work on their page, who can hear the sound of their voice, give them immediate feedback. There's really a sense of immediacy to what we do. I need to be able to respond to exactly what's happening in front of me, and the many subtle hints and many subtle ways that students express themselves, and you just don't get that when you're not face to face. There's just so much more ability to adapt and change and respond to your students' needs when they're in front of you, as opposed to interacting through a computer. Most classrooms are just too dynamic in their nature to be able to be limited and restricted to this form of communication through a screen, through a webcam, through a microphone. And no matter how much we try to use better technology, it just doesn't match the same experience as being in the room, interacting with a living, breathing person.
Thanks, Jason. You've really explained how teaching is so much more than just standing in front of a classroom and delivering information and collecting papers and marking them. There's so much more that goes into it. And after this amount of time, we're really feeling that, just that gap of having that sort of interaction. David, I'd like to go to you next. What do you see are the benefits of face-to-face learning?
I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but communication is verbal and nonverbal. For sighted people, there's a lot of visual cues. For we blind people, there's a lot of sound. For learners, some are visual learners, some are more audio learners. And of course, for a certain number of students with disabilities, they need attention of an educational assistant or otherwise to help facilitate their participation. And all of those things become harder or impossible during if we're not in the classroom in person. Now, I am not going to be, as I mentioned before, I'm not doctrinaire about this. I went about teaching a class this fall of a dozen or 11 students, 10 or 11 students at U of T, that is a very intensive dialogue-driven course where I interact with my students extensively, way more than in other courses. And I tried it online and I was extremely skeptical that it would work. And it actually worked really well. But A, these are young adults. B, they're law students, super bright, very driven. And C, I had to work my ass off. And that's fine. But that's just to say, we of course, we are open to being creative and thinking of new ways of doing things. But we can't take a success story like that and say, okay, therefore, it's all great. The thing that I would put, the way I'd put it to you is this. I see our education system as being full of teachers and other instructional staff and principals who are there because they want to teach and they want to help kids learn, blossom, and grow. That's why they do this. I see our education system design is replete with barriers, disability barriers, and they put handcuffs on you as teachers. And those of us who are advocating for an education accessibility standard, I'm on this advisory committee that's making recommendations on what it should include. And credit to OSSTF back in, I think, 2013 for sharing in our call on the government to agree to develop such a regulation. But I see that regulation, by getting rid of the barriers in the education system, the disability barriers, as taking the handcuffs off you, freeing you to be able to serve those kids better. And I see the move, any move away from in-class teaching, with very limited exceptions, like the students who benefit more from distance learning, as just another form of handcuffs. Now, because of COVID, sometimes that has to happen, but we got to minimize it. And I think the hybrid learning model is an example where it is completely avoidable. That handcuff doesn't have to be there. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. There's people have stayed in teaching because they love to teach, but we are seeing people now who are leaving the profession, and that's a huge concern. Many people working in education are saying, I love to teach, but I just can't do this anymore. And it's just absolutely exhausting and defeating. And that's a major concern that we have going forward. Riya, what are the benefits of face-to-face?
I think just from the student perspective, and just kind of echoing Jason a little bit here as well, of course, there's the hands-on learning. That's something that's extremely difficult to replicate online, but it makes it a lot easier to actually retain information and also find interest in what you're learning. Attention span, especially with younger students, is very difficult to obtain. And so when they're learning online, it's very difficult to find that connection to the curriculum and the material that they're learning. But also another important thing is the development of soft skills, learning to work collaboratively with other students, learning to communicate in different forms, developing those interpersonal skills, which are so essential, especially as students, go out into the world and in the future into the workforce. These are skills that are not technical in the sense that they can easily be taught by following something like a module or learning even through curriculum. It's something that you learn through interaction and engagement with other people in the classroom. Another thing is, of course, the increased level of accountability that comes with face-to-face learning. It's difficult to develop a strong work ethic when there's no one watching you. And we're, of course, leaving it up to, complete integrity to, whether it comes to assessments, it comes to collaborative projects. And that's another important thing that students need to consider as they grow older and go into the workforce. But one thing that I really wanted to highlight was, school is more than just about learning. It's also about socialization. It's about making friends. And students have actually indicated that returning back to in-person learning has helped them cope with some of the challenges and social anxieties brought upon by the COVID-19 pandemic. And to kind of highlight that, I did want to share a testimonial that a 10th grade student that attends Keswick High School had shared with me. And she said, my family has experienced multiple sleepless nights caused due to stress, anxiety, and work overload during the pandemic. By attending face-to-face, I've been able to reconnect with my teachers one-on-one, make new friends, join clubs, and finally return to a schedule that helps me feel a sense of normal during these difficult times. So I do want to emphasize that, this student is referring to face-to-face learning as normal, not hybrid, not online, not virtual. Face-to-face is normal for her. And she's found that after going back to school in person and interacting with students and interacting with her teacher, she was able to build those collaborative relationships and also address some of the mental health concerns she had been experiencing while learning online through hybrid. And of course, when you think about access to guidance counselors, access to social workers, it's a lot more difficult in the online format. In anyways, a lot of those staff members are stretched thin when you think about the ratio of guidance counselor to students in high schools. So that's a really important thing to think about, and also how face-to-face learning can actually be a mechanism through which we reintegrate back to our normal, not thinking of a new normal, but how can we reintegrate back to the normal that we once had.
Okay, sorry. Thanks, Riya. I'm going to go to Beyhan, and sometimes when you do questions like this and there's 4 people, you say, well, there's not much left to say, but I have a feeling there's a lot left to say about the benefits of face-to-face. Go ahead, Beyhan.
Yes, I do have a lot to say. First, I wanted to pick up on David's point about these barriers, right? And I want to sort of, when I studied online learning in the Toronto District School Board, a lot of, again, these were self-selected students who were in senior classes, bound for university, and they expressed a positive experience with online learning. But my argument has always been that there are systemic barriers and systemic issues. There are emergencies that preceded the pandemic. We have a crisis of racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, misogyny, and oppression. And when students are encountering those barriers, when we have online learning to direct them towards, when they're expressing harm within the education system that needs to be systemically addressed, my concern is online learning becomes a way for the system to displace that responsibility onto students and their families. Right? So we're not going to deal with this. We're going to, you're experiencing bullying, you're experiencing harm. We are going to, you have the option to learn online and learn at home. And that tension was actually carried through a lot of the interviews because my focus was interviewing students. That was sort of my work. And when I look at the context of research in Canada and the United States, there hasn't been a lot of research on K-12, and where there has been research is in the United States, where for-profit education management or organizations deliver most of online learning asynchronously in those contexts. And we saw during the pandemic a significant shift in the demographics of who was taking online learning as it was mass delivered. And we saw that students most vulnerable to systemic harm being forced to learn online. So when we see that we have health inequities, we see that those students are turning to online learning. And there was, the research that emerged pre-pandemic talked about where situations in which you have a wider divide in achievement online asynchronously, but then you have sort of TDSB who had reported on their virtual school, which is not hybrid, virtual school, where you have a dedicated teacher, reported consistent achievement with accommodations for the pandemic, but said 84% of students prefer to learn in person. So I want to also trouble this idea that just because you might be getting the grade, that actually means that's what success looks like. And in a public education system where we are not accrediting, like that's not the sole function. It is also to ensure that students have relationships to their communities that are positive, students experience belonging, students experience inclusion. And when they don't, we have to invest in the system that we have to ensure that they are thriving and not turn them to what has really become a cheap fix for a very expensive problem that often reflects inequities within the communities themselves. And so the last thing I'll sort of say is these, as we looked at research from the pandemic, the COVID-19 advisory table had put out a really comprehensive report in which they cited all of the benefits for in-person learning. And it really begins with the recognition that education is critical to protecting the life, health, and public functioning of students. And it's an inconvenient truth that many families do depend on in-person learning for waged work, especially women who have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and who have taken on a lot of the care work when school closures taken place, including myself with 2 kids. Believe me, it's like I felt the weight of arriving at this today, hearing the news that we might possibly close again. And schools are more than just a classroom, right? They connect students and families to the broader community. There's mental health and developmental services. And this report highlights that the impact of the pandemic on under-resourced communities cannot be overstated. So I think, and what we have all collectively been calling for is a comprehensive investment in education, health, social services. These things are not disconnected from one another. And so when we see public education struggling, it's because we're also struggling with poverty. We're also struggling with racism. There are investments that are missing, social investments that we collectively need to think about, and not just school as sort of being a very sort of separate space from those larger contexts.
Thanks, Beyhan. It's a very good segue to the third question, but I also never try to miss an opportunity to mention that education is an investment. We commissioned the Conference Board of Canada in 2019 to do a report, and it came back saying that every dollar you spend on education comes back as $1.30 to the economy because of the effects that public education has on the rest of the population. And it's so important that we view it as an investment, and that the effort and the dollars spent are worth the investment. And it takes a lot of convincing that that's where you need to spend the money, but the money comes back. And why wouldn't a government want to invest in education is my question that I keep asking. So I'm going to go to Riya to start off the third question. Throughout the pandemic, many societal inequities have been revealed, and we know that many marginalized, equity and sovereignty-seeking members of our communities have fallen behind or have been completely left out by decisions made in education. What do you see as the inequities that some students face with respect to online or hybrid learning, and what do you think this government could do to resolve these inequities? It's a big question.
Absolutely. I think this kind of brings me back to what we were discussing earlier involving freedom of choice. Especially, it's important to recognize that face-to-face learning is a privilege that not every student is afforded, especially in COVID-19, especially in the pandemic and in emergency crisis learning. We've seen how racialized communities have been impacted disproportionately by COVID, and even access to vaccines has been difficult. And usually students who are, Black, racialized, Indigenous, they tend to live in multi-generational homes. And it's difficult to have that individual space where they can study and focus on their school. And understanding those barriers and equity is extremely important, not just in terms of finding a space, but also in terms of access to technology and Wi-Fi that's required to complete online and hybrid learning. I can just say for my personal experience, I'm very fortunate to have access to a device to attend my classes online and to have access to Wi-Fi. But anytime, and I'm sure we can all attest to this, anytime you have your Wi-Fi cutting in and out, it's such an inconvenience, and it's so annoying how you can get booted out of a class, miss a lecture, or miss a lesson that's not being recorded, and come back and have to kind of fill in those gaps yourself. It's very difficult. And especially with special needs students, those disadvantages are even heightened in that area. Many students who have not yet been identified as needing extra help, and those who have but don't have access to it just yet, are facing these disadvantages as well, because teachers are pulled in so many different directions, and the learning gaps are widening as they're being pulled in those different directions. And of course, there's also economic inequities. Some students have to go to work. and help their parents pay the bills because of COVID. Because a lot of people have, lost their jobs and are facing, difficult health circumstances. It's very, harmful if we view this in a very narrow perspective and look at education as being, its own entity that doesn't impact anything else in our society. We have to look at it as the forefront and how it impacts the workplace, how it impacts healthcare. It's all intertwined. And this government, really needs to recognize that public education is the one equalizer in terms of, students from diverse households and coming from diverse identities. It's something that places everyone on, at least from a starting point, places us on the same field. And it provides youth with, skills and abilities and a pathway to make their lives better and more hopeful in ways that online learning simply does not.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. It is the great equalizer. I'm going to go to Jason next, and then David, and then Beyhan. So inequities, but also what should the government be doing to resolve them? Jason?
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by just acknowledging what Beyhan touched upon about how we know that the students who are already the most vulnerable to systemic inequities are disproportionately represented among the online students. So every barrier which is placed because of online learning is now compacting on the barriers that they are already facing, which is just compounding the inequities. I also want to mention what Riya said about public education being the great equalizer, and that means a lot to me. That's always been a philosophy that has driven my outlook on teaching and on education. This is why we have public education. It is so that every single individual has the opportunity to gain the same benefits, to learn and gain the skills, the knowledge, and just empower themselves. And currently we have a two-tiered system, a multi-tiered system really. But when we look at the inequities that exist because of a hybrid setting or an online virtual setting, which is being presented as an equal alternative to face-to-face learning when it is not, it's something that again is becoming normalized, and I fear may be with us after the pandemic. Looking just at the access to technology is just one of the inequities that we see. It's a significant inequity that impacts both students and teachers, actually, and it affects the learning and the teaching experience. From a student perspective, it's not enough to just say that school boards are providing each student with a Chromebook and, that makes it all fair and equal. The devices that the boards are providing students with when they're learning from home, they're often very low end, entry-level Chromebooks, tiny screens, weak webcams, low resolution, slow processors, microphones that barely work. And that's not even taking into account the differences in internet bandwidth that students may have at home. We can't assume that every online learner has high-speed internet with unlimited bandwidth. And I think it's often just assumed that if a student chooses to learn online, that must mean that they have all the technology they need for it, that they have high-speed internet and the fastest devices. And again, it goes back to the idea of it's not necessarily a choice, right? As Riya said, online learning in person is a privilege, and we can't just assume that everyone is just choosing to learn online because it best suits them. Sometimes they need to make that choice. They have to learn online for a variety of reasons. It could be because of health. It could be because of economic reasons, as you mentioned. But either way, they don't deserve to have an inferior experience, which is what they're having. And we've touched upon this in the other questions as well about the interpersonal interactions that students are missing out on when they're learning online. All of these issues create significant barriers. From a teacher perspective as well, and we can't forget that educators are people too, and we have to think about the equity from the perspective of educators. We also get board issued devices, and once again, it may just be a cheap Chromebook and a webcam, and that may not be sufficient. In fact, it usually isn't sufficient to perform what I would call adequate synchronous instruction. most of us do end up having to supplement the equipment that we're provided with our own personal technology. And I consider myself very privileged. I am able to afford technology to enhance what I do. And I'm often complimented on the things I do in my classroom. People see how I'm using the technology and how I'm trying to make the most of this hybrid situation. But they don't realize that it's costing me literally thousands of dollars of my own personal technology to have an iPad and the stylus and different camera setups that I can use when I move around the classroom and so that I can write notes so that the people at home can see as well. It's not fair to expect every educator to be able to bring that into their own classroom. And thus, when educators can't, and they're only using what the boards provide them with, they get misrepresented as not working as hard or not trying as hard to make it work. And that's completely unfair to them. What we're provided with is basically based on the assumption that all teachers do is stand at the front of the room and just lecture to their students. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, in online learning, in hybrid learning, in virtual learning, that it is based on this this outdated conception of what learning is, where a teacher stands at the front of the room and students just sit there and copy notes for 75 minutes or 2.5 hours, as our periods are at the moment. But again, as I've mentioned before, our classrooms are just too dynamic for that. All of this is compounded in a hybrid classroom where the at-home students are just getting the short end of the stick. Like I mentioned before, every time the internet fails, which happens more often than people might assume, they are kicked out of class. Right there, that's a huge, huge equity issue. Can you imagine in-person students if every week or every couple of times a week, they were just physically kicked out of their classrooms and told, sorry, come back in, check again in half an hour, maybe the class would be running then at that time. And even in that case, you would presume that the class would stop when they're not in the room, but in a hybrid setting, the class has to keep going on for the students who are in the room. Meanwhile, the kids at home are just waiting, hoping that they will get to continue with their lesson. And again, as was mentioned, these are kids who may not have chosen to be in that situation. It's just compounding the unfairness and the inequity that they're facing. In terms of what the government can do to remedy this, first of all, obviously, we need to stop hybrid learning, and we cannot make online or virtual learning a mandatory part of students' education. It can't be forced on students. It has to be an option, and it has to be something that is funded properly so that it's not just an afterthought where you just stick a webcam into a classroom and say you're getting the same experience. If we have students who need to learn online or need to learn virtually, they deserve a fully funded virtual school with dedicated educators and dedicated technology to best make use of that model of learning.
Plain and simple. Yes, Jason, that's exactly what we need. That's where we need to go with this. David, you are a skilled advocate and lobbyist. I know that sometimes it takes years and years, but what are the inequities and what can we ask the government to do? What should the government be doing?
Okay, can you hear me now? Oh, no.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to put something in the chat and it seems not to be working. I will get this to you, but on the question of what needs to be done, the good news is the heavy lifting on that's already been done. You see, just for those who may not know about this, the kindergarten to grade 12 Education Standards Development Committee, that's a big name that I sit on, is appointed under by the government to recommend what needs to be done in a new regulation to tear down the barriers impeding students with disabilities in our schools. And I'm on that committee, and it's a committee that's made jointly up of people from the disabilities community and people from the education side. So one of the members of the committee, one of my colleagues, is a rep from OSSTF, for example, but there's school board reps, trustee reps, and so on. And it's 50-50 split. Well, when the pandemic hit, we set up a subcommittee to make recommendations about what to do in light of COVID for students with disabilities. And we submitted a report back in July of last year. If I can get the chat to work, or maybe the message just sent, I can send you the link, and otherwise I'll send it to Tracy to share. But the report is not only on the government's website, it's on ours. It got bipartisan support from the disability sector and education sector reps on our subcommittee. And I can tell you that from what I've seen that the government's done so far, almost a year and a half since we submitted it, is to implement almost none of it. So the actual work has been done, and it's not an emergency. They knew about this now almost 18 months ago. In terms of advocacy, what I think will make the difference, and you're going to see this coming from us already. If you don't already, I encourage you to get AODA Alliance email updates. If you go to aodaalliance.org, www.aodaalliance.org, there's a sign up link right on the homepage. We've actually already written the major political party leaders, we're nonpartisan, and said, here's what we need you to commit to do in the next election. And we gave them like 7 months notice because we wanted a chance. It's not a short list. And it includes education elements. And we're going to be going public with this. We don't endorse or oppose any party. We just try to get commitments from everybody. But here's the deal. There are 2 million students in Ontario funded schools. Of them, about 1/3 at least have disabilities. 1/3 families is a lot of voters. To the extent that they see these issues as they bear on them as worth pressing candidates for, that could change the whole dynamic here. And that's just talking about it from the perspective I'm raising, a disability perspective. If you add other equity-seeking groups, if you just frankly add everybody, and you've got a substantial voice, and that's what we're going to be busy with. Back to you.
Thanks, David. I believe Tracy's put all the links, including the AODA Alliance as well, and hopefully we'll have people signing up for those email updates too. We're going to go to Beyhan, please, with other things that, talk about the inequities and what the government needs to do. I tend to be a little bit more partisan, so I appreciate that David is not. We'll see where Beyhan goes.
Well, I'll defer to the work that I did with Sue this year, where we spoke with secondary teachers in Alberta and Ontario, 2 of whom have something in common. You can guess what it is. And they're also the only 2 provinces that have in-person learning as an option. And I think one of the sort of like really notable findings is really how much variation there is, which makes sense because the function of crisis is to destabilize, right? And so we had these policies that were, in a sense, one size fits all, online learning policies when, to Jason's point, there were teachers too who just outside of, like, just very not too far outside of the city, were paying out of their pocket hundreds of dollars a month for their internet. There were folks in rural, remote, and northern communities who were delivering asynchronous packages because it was not an option. They were just not included in the planning at all. And so part of what makes equity is that we're centering folks who have the greatest barrier and who are the most under-resourced to meet their needs. And I think the most illustrative of this too is like this kind of the contradiction that happened between policy and practice and the ways that this government had hyped up technology was this iPad fiasco when we had the first closures. And so there was all of this, self-congratulatory talk about the fact that we got all these iPads. But what we didn't see first was that school boards were subsidizing these iPads, that these iPads took weeks to get into the hands of students. And by that point, we were halfway through school closures, that once they had the iPad, they were often caring for siblings, or they were, while their parents worked essential jobs, or they were working essential jobs themselves. And so teachers, even with students who had the connection whenever they happened to get it, we're still struggling to maintain engagement. And there were students whose home environments were not conducive to learning, who needed in-person learning to focus. And there was a lot of reporting on just students who disappeared, right? And the tension that teachers held and the guilt they felt for circumstances that were out of their control. They were being directed to provide continuity, but we weren't in a situation that provided the conditions for continuity for a lot of the students. And so that's, that's the inequity around the technology. And of course, with hybrid, we see that virtual students are more disadvantaged in this context because they're competing with in-person learners who are demanding a finite, teachers who have a finite amount of energy and attention. And so in addition to the points that Jason raised with regards to this is Memorandum 164, the mandate for synchronous learning needs to go, mandatory online learning needs to go, virtual schools with dedicated teachers during an emergency needs to take place. And I will add to that to say that we need to have safe conditions so that students can have in-person learning as an option. This pandemic, we're our third school year into it. We know we're not anticipating it's going to disappear. We're going to have to think about forevermore how to incorporate physical safety in a intentional way. And so yes, there are calls immediately in the short term for rapid tests. Smaller class sizes was an option in the TDSB, a reasonable option that was rejected. And we need, mental health supports and supports to address opportunity gaps that emerged as a result of the disruption. And we really don't, I think, need like study after study, as much as I am studying, to show the obvious, right? That the obvious is that disruption impacts learning, and we need an investment to recover, not cuts like we've seen, where we need an investment to recover from that disruption, to better respond to an inevitable future disruption. And that really it really requires us to think also about the conditions of our schools, the lack of just basics that we have been struggling for. And I really want to get to a point where we're not fighting for the basics, that we're fighting for that we have a kind of public consciousness raising, where we see, as to Karen's point, education as an investment, because when we shortchange ourselves in the short term, we see these kinds of 3 years dragging out because we're doing everything in half measures and never end up really getting to the other side, it feels like.
Thanks, Beyhan. So the next question, I'm going to start with David, and it's something that actually started out before the pandemic, and now it remains as big of a concern. In 2019, the government mandated that students in high school must complete 4 online courses to graduate. In the end, the agreement was that it was 2, and that there would be the ability for students to opt out of the mandatory requirement. That came through collective bargaining, but it started out as it would be 4 mandatory in order to be able to graduate. And one argument that was used to support mandatory e-learning courses was that kids need to take online courses to improve their skills necessary for the 21st century workforce. We heard that a lot. This is the way things are, they need to be ready for it. So David, what are your thoughts on mandating online courses for high school students?
Well, I don't get there if the courses aren't accessible, period. Like the discussion's over. And the government's response, which was, well, we'll exempt students with special education needs, is not a solution either, because it's basically saying, we're letting you off. You know, you don't have to do this. I mean, if it's something that they think people should know in order to be in the workforce, then telling students with special ed needs that we're going to, you know, let you off rather than fix their accessibility says that's an important piece of curriculum, but we're not going to teach it to you. Well, David Onley, the former lieutenant governor of Ontario, who has a disability, said some years ago that the national unemployment rate facing people with disabilities in Canada is not only a national crisis, it's a national shame. Well, if you need that skill for the workplace, that's just pouring more oil on the fire, whatever that bloody metaphor is, in terms of denying them that. But not only that, but if that is a skill you need for the workplace, is the most effective way to teach it to just throw students in and say, well, we're going to teach you math this way or history this way or whatever? Or does it make sense that we adapt our curriculum to include training in effective use of online learning, which I suspect would probably be best taught in a classroom, right? So if you think about it, the argument is bogus. It makes no sense. But the way it's been carried out is to carry on this one-size-fits-all discriminatory approach to students with disabilities. These may not be the arguments that OSSTF has used, but I think these are really valid arguments to add to one's arsenal. Again, if it is something one wants to voluntarily opt into, that's a whole different story. But short of that, it doesn't make any sense to me. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks. All very logical. Thank you, David. Beyhan, your thoughts on mandatory e-learning courses in order to graduate?
So when mandatory online learning was announced in 2019, I tweeted into the world my angst about this policy announcement. I was then researching a very obscure, nobody cared about the work I was doing, and all of a sudden it became relevant in a way that I feel a lot of tension about. It was clear to me at the time that this was about finding efficiencies. I've seen this rhetoric before. I've seen this discourse before. I studied the way that online learning had expanded in the United States, and I was seeing the same rhetoric around really, which was the impact of which would cut funding to public education and really effectively work to impact labor and union bust. So in interviews with media, I was describing the kind of inequities this would likely produce. And at the time, after, we didn't have details about what this was going to look like. But in a leaked proposal in March, I don't know if anyone remembers this, we learned about what this would look like and how it would impact students. So the first, and David referenced this, that TVO would be tasked with not only managing enrollment, but also delivering fully independent, standardized online learning. And this isn't, again, a really so much partisan, because TVO was included in the 2016 renegotiation with the license, with Desire to Learn, who's licensed to deliver online learning. But this is important, again, to make the distinction with mandatory online learning versus hybrid and virtual school, because mandatory online learning is asynchronous, and that's distinct. That in many ways sort of puts teachers in the background, and also is a model that has very low rates of retention, especially in K to 12. The stated intention in the proposal was not only to increase demand and the number of students learning online, and even with an opt-out clause, we know that that's unevenly accessed, and so we know who has knowledge of the system and confidence to navigate the system and is rewarded for navigating the system, and who is disciplined for navigating the system and often is forced into choices that they otherwise wouldn't make in an informed way. But the stated intention was actually to make money from it, and by selling it internationally. Again, not new. TV Ontario has been selling online learning for many, many years. It's now being it's now exploited to a greater degree, and it's included in their plan, their 5-year plan, or however long it is. And so with regards to the argument of this 21st century learning, they don't need to learn isolated from their peers in an asynchronous environment. They don't, and isolated from their teacher to successfully enter the workforce. What work are we imagining that they're doing? What problems do we imagine they're responding to in isolation? We are really thinking about, especially after this pandemic, complex issues that require teacher support to navigate, that they see themselves, we talk about seeing themselves reflected in the classroom. Well, we're not going to see that possible in a standardized environment. And you do require standardization actually to make online courses accessible, because even when I think about what's involved in the technical expertise in producing asynchronous online content, it is not something that a teacher is going to be able to do on their own, and that is it's navigated through it's TV Ontario that's mediating that. And there's also a difference between in short, really forcing students to learn online, and the impact, as I said, of which it removes the teacher from the classroom. In TV Ontario courses, there's no the teacher's the marker, and if you have a question as a student, you have to send an email to a separate person. And so it is by definition, to me, union busting, and really sort of removing the working conditions for teachers to effectively teach. And so, it's, again, in-person education is not perfect. World's not perfect. The society in which we live is reflected in the public education system. But the alternative to that is not a cheap model of online education. It's an investment in teaching conditions and learning conditions, so both can thrive.
I'm so glad you mentioned that report, because I remember one of the most offensive parts of it was the line that said, the biggest problem in education today is that it's not generating income. Like, okay, I said education is an investment. I don't mean that we're generating income by selling courses. I mean, we're generating income by we're saving the system money. That's what we're doing by investing in education. We're not selling it to the highest bidder. That report was really quite offensive and was never fully released, because I think they realized what an error it was in what they had produced. So Riya, I just have to ask you, because you graduated high school recently, how do you feel prepared for the 21st century workforce if you didn't have mandatory e-learning or online courses? How can you be ready?
I know, it's a question I ask myself every day. I have no clue. I'm lucky that I graduated before the pandemic, but that's something that I'm navigating now, because even at York we have completely online courses, and we're attempting to shift back next semester, although I'm not sure entirely how that will turn out. But one thing that I think is really important in having these conversations about online courses, about the hybrid model, is to really step back and look at what is actually going on here. What is this a part of? And it's really a move towards the privatization of public education. And it's clear that this agenda is to underfund public education. And we've seen that with the 2019 cuts. Whenever there is a deficit, the solution is to cut public services. And what we find happening is a lot of blame being shifted towards educators. We have, we've seen several demonstrations about how increase of class sizes, canceled programming, lower supports for special needs students, reduced funding for arts programs or extracurriculars, how this impacts students especially. But parents are being told, hey, it's to save money. But we're really cutting key areas and instead saying, okay, well, educators, they're only fighting against us because they want higher salaries. And we're simplifying the issue at hand and making it about educator salaries. And I think that's really what is part of this. It's kind of an ideological tactic as we shift towards kind of a neoliberal agenda being advanced. And ironically, we see, an over 5% increase in salaries in police, which is, especially with everything that's been going on and moves to defund policing, that's extremely ironic. But again, the result of privatization is not only lower quality education, but you're looking at widening the gap and of course, destabilizing the future. And online learning and mandating online learning, online courses is just one step. The hybrid model is a massive step, and attempting to normalize this model is a massive step. And once again, we have students, vulnerable students being left behind. And the blame is being shifted towards educators, but really we have to step back and look at what is really happening within the province and why is it so important that we all speak up on this issue.
Thanks, Riya. I'm glad you survived high school and that you'll be ready for the future. I'm going to roll the last two questions together for you, Jason, because I have you on as answering, your thoughts on mandatory online learning, but then your vision, considering all that we've discussed tonight, what's your vision for the future of education in Ontario? Go ahead.
Thank you. Regarding mandatory online learning, I think I can actually be pretty brief about that because I feel like my fellow panelists have really just addressed like all of the issues that I really wanted to bring to the forefront. But there are a few things I do want to mention. Firstly, I think we need to acknowledge that every single learner in Ontario who has participated in the last 20 months of school has had more than enough experience navigating these online platforms and whatever type of learning skills the government claims they need to learn through online remote instruction. It's almost kind of insulting, I think, to students to say that they need more mandatory remote learning on top of what they've already had to experience over the last 2 years almost. That should just be completely removed from any dialogue, from any conversation. They've done their time, so to speak. They've served their time. And it's ridiculous that it was negotiated to an opt-out scenario where students can opt out. As Beyhan mentioned, that's putting an advantage or a disadvantage rather on students and families who may not know how to navigate the subtleties of a system where they need to opt out of something. The default should be face-to-face learning so that the students who do want or need to do remote learning can opt into that option. In other words, pretty much exactly what it has always been. We've always had this option to do online asynchronous learning, and it's never been the default where you have to do that and opt out later. So it makes no sense to go backwards, in my opinion. Let's also recall that shortly before the pandemic, before online learning became not an option but a choice, and before the ministry did begin using this language of mandatory online learning, the Ministry of Education's own website had text that acknowledged that online learning may not be suitable for all learners. They literally had that on the ministry website. And as soon as they put that in as a bargain or a point against us in our negotiations of putting in mandatory online learning, that magically vanished from their website. And I'm sure that somebody has some screenshots of that somewhere, but it was there. And the ministry also, like many post-secondary institutions still do, they had a questionnaire, I believe, to allow learners to self-assess if online learning was suitable for them. And a lot of universities and colleges still have that because they know, and we know, that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's not something that all students can be successful at. So why are we making all students go through the same cookie cutter approach when we know we're trying to fit them in a system that is not going to be to their benefit? It shouldn't be a one size fits all learning models. And to go back to what David said in the beginning, a colleague of mine made a similar point that if these skills are so important, if we want students to have these 21st century competencies, whatever the government defines them as, we need a course that teaches them that. We need to train them in how to engage in these online environments and use this technology. It doesn't make sense to say, okay, you're going to learn how to engage in these online platforms by learning chemistry online. And I think that's the point that David was trying to make. It just doesn't make sense, right? I just don't know how else to say that we can't force students into a model that is not one size fits all and pretend that it is. In terms of the follow-up question of what do I next for the future of education and what are the next steps we need to take, we've already touched on this, and we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I don't think anyone is saying that online learning or remote learning shouldn't exist. It serves a purpose. It meets the needs of many learners. It can be a very valuable accommodation. We have the technology to do it, which I think is a great blessing to us all. It's amazing that we live in an age where it's even possible for us to be able to teach over a distance, but it's not a solution to every problem. It can't be something that is mandatory. It can't be something that is forced. It can't be something that all students have to experience because it saves money or because of some made up reason about learning 21st century competencies. If it's something we're going to use, and it should be something we use, it needs to be something that is specifically invested in, that teachers are specifically trained for, that the students who are engaging in it, we make sure that they have the technology and the comfort that they need to engage in it properly. We can't just throw it out there and say to the school boards that they need to figure it out. And that's something our government has been doing for a very long time. Well, specifically the Ford government and Stephen Lecce as our education minister, he announces these grand plans and then he says, school boards, it's up to you to figure it out. Whenever somebody points out a flaw or a limitation or a barrier or an inequity, he just says, you know what, school boards have been given what they need, they will figure it out. That's not leadership. That's not helping anyone. That is not addressing problems. That is passing the buck. And it's damaging to students, it's damaging to educators, it's damaging to our whole society.
And abdication of duty too. They've been known for that in the Conservative government. Okay, so next I'm going to go to Riya. Riya, your thoughts on the future of education? What are the steps that can be taken?
I think just speaking, on behalf of our coalition, Your Communities for Public Ed, our ask is that, this form of crisis learning, the hybrid model, is not normalized. And we definitely need adequate funding to support face-to-face learning and also mental health resources to support students and staff. Of course, we're still in a pandemic and we're uncertain of the future and what that's going to look like. And the variant has brought upon new challenges. And in terms of what, next semester and the new year is going to look like, it's still a challenge. But after experiencing hybrid, we've definitely developed a new appreciation for face-to-face learning. We often take for granted what we have until we lose it. And this is a perfect example. But, I think that the easiest thing to do and the best solution going forward is to listen to students and educators. It is one thing to, speak on behalf of a group that, you have no experience being a part of. And it is another thing to actually consult with key stakeholders and interact with them and understand, why is this not working and what can we do to change it? You know, it goes beyond listening and even just beyond acknowledgement of the problem, but it's important to have and implement strategies and take action to actually address the problem. So, you know, speaking on behalf of students here today, listen to students, give them a platform to raise their voice. Don't just put them on, you know, performative advisory committees and not actually implement what they're saying. Listen to them, implement the strategies that they're suggesting, and hear from students directly, because they're the ones who are impacted the most by everything that's going on.
Thanks, Riya. Really appreciate it. Just before I go to Beyhan, I'm going to go to Beyhan, and then I'm going to go to David for the final point on this question. But I want to mention to people that these webinars that we're doing are available on OSSTF's YouTube channel. This won't be available tomorrow, but it will be available in the near future and will be available for sharing, because what I'm hearing from all of the panelists are such important points, and it really needs to be shared, and this information needs to be there. And, you know, for people who say, well, I think it's probably okay, or, you know, it's 21st century learning, these are all the points that we need to reinforce and to look at what we need going forward. So Beyhan, your thoughts of the future and what we need to do.
So I'm going to be hopeful, and I'm not going to be cynical, because hope is coming from a place of love. And I want to point to the things already being done really well. So, which unfortunately is an outcome of crisis. We have seen folks collaborate from different sectors, some different public sectors. We've seen folks collaborating within public sectors, within education. This panel is an example of that, and having folks who are coming from different vantage points, contributing to a collective project. And my hope is that we recognize collectively the crisis that the public service, public good is undergoing, and that we not only ensure that we are contacting folks who represent us to ensure that what we think is important is put at the forefront, but that we also see pressure points beyond elected representatives to include your friends and family, many of whom may never even think about this, who we are connected to unions and school boards. And ultimately, I've been of the mind that just doing something is better than nothing. I think there are, and if you're doing something, if you could do one more thing, maybe, that it is going to be, in this particular moment, very, very, the decisions we make in this next year or two is going to be as foundational to whatever the future is going to look like. And it requires us to counter cynicism and counter the exhaustion we feel from the constant onslaught, to look for places where there is work already being done, and look to that for a place of inspiration and hope, and just to carry that forward and carry the rage forward in a loving, productive way, so that we can have an other end to this that is actually better than whatever that normal was, which wasn't the best normal for a lot of us.
Thanks, Beyhan. Really appreciate that perspective. David, what do you think is next for the future of public education in Ontario? What are the next steps to make sure we do the best by Ontario students, all students?
Well, can I end on an uplifting note? Here goes. I started by talking to you about how our school system has been for a long time designed and operated on a rather unacceptable premise that it's basically designed for students without disabilities, and students with disabilities are an afterthought. And the good news is this: there is an agenda for reform. The agenda for reform is doable. It's required by law, and it's achieving a consensus between disability sector and the education sector. The Kindergarten to Grade 12 Standards Development Committee that I serve on has rendered an initial report last spring to the government, which was then sent out for public feedback. We've gotten the feedback and we're now finalizing our report. Our hope is that it will be submitted to the government by the early in January, and the government has a statutory obligation to post that report upon receiving it. So they don't control the content, nor can they lawfully delay its disclosure to the public, though they have a record of doing the latter. And I've read all the feedback. We all have on our committee, this bipartisan committee with union folks, trustee folks, school board administrator folks, disability community folks, working collaboratively. Guess what? We got overwhelming feedback in support of our initial report. And what we're doing right now is deciding what tweaks, what additions, what things we left out that people said, hey, you forgot this, to plug in. And we're in the middle of that. And, we're not done yet. But I got to tell you, there was no major rejection of our agenda. So whoever forms the next government, and indeed the current government, will be delivered on a silver platter. A comprehensive agenda for reform. B, that has buy-in jointly from the education sector and the disability sector, from the employer and employee side of the education sector. And that resulted over this past summer from the broadest consultation that has ever gone on in this province on this topic of how are we serving students with disabilities and what needs to be fixed. So the agenda of what to do to fix it is going to be mapped out for the government. Now, I got to tell you, it's a long report. It's already the initial report's 185. It's written by a committee, so there's different chunks written by different people, and we all agree it probably could be used in edit, but we don't care. The content is good. So I can tell you that I and my coalition and others are going to be advocating to get this agenda adopted by the current government in its last month or whoever forms the next government. We'll be seeking election commitments to implement it. And just as we turn to the OSSTF and other teachers unions to support our call for the government to agree to do an education standard, we'll be turning to you to support our call for implementing this report's agenda for what it should include. And you have the good fortune that, as I mentioned, one of your colleagues from representing your union is one of my colleagues on our commitment, and we're all working together really, really well. So I have a real sense that we know what needs to be done. Of course, I also have a keen sense that we have a huge uphill battle getting it done. But I'll tell you, from the disability rights movement, uphill battles are where we live. We're used to it. That's just, for us, that's home sweet home. So stay tuned and looking forward to collaborating with you. Just in closing, thank you so much for including me. I'm kind of the outsider here, but I'm really honored to be included and warm and receive such a warm engagement on this. Best to you all and stay safe.
Thanks, David, and thanks for participating. And no one is an outsider. We all care about education and we all need to do our part. I often say to people, you can do something little, you can do something medium-sized, you can do something big, but Beyhan, if it's all right, I'd like to add and do one thing more, because I think it's really important. If you can just do one more thing, you're really making a difference. And I appreciate the note of hope that we've ended on, talking about collaboration and consultation and then direction. And that's what we need going forward, is really to know that we've got some action that we can take, whatever color of government we have in the end after June 2nd, 2022, we are going to continue educating the students of Ontario, and that's what needs to be done. And again, you can watch this again or other webinars that we've done on our OSSTF YouTube. And thank you so much for participating, being here, listening, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation, the good space with fellow panelists in the audience.
Thank you. And we end just about right on time too. So thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks, Jason.